Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. You know, we always try to pick some really fascinating stuff to unpack.
Right.
And this one, you really sent us something special. We got these two documents, the 90 Appeal to G20 Nations
Okay.
and a proposal for recognition of the UMUD initiative to the United Nations.
Right.
And I mean, clearly you are interested in these huge, global ideas,
Yeah.
right? About peace and harmony and different ways that we might get there.
Right.
Our job today is to kind of go through this and figure out what are the big ideas here.
Right. We're going to get into these documents and pull out the most
Yeah.
compelling and interesting and potentially transformative concepts that they contain.
Yeah, and I gotta say, get ready for some really surprising stuff.
Yeah.
This
It's been a
one,
wild ride.
yeah, this one has some really interesting angles that
Yeah.
I would not have predicted
Absolutely.
just from the title.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about why the date 9/11 is so important to this proposal, beyond just obviously the tragedy that everybody knows.
Yeah.
And we're also going to talk about an entirely new global body that they're proposing
Yeah.
to run alongside
Yeah.
the UN.
Alongside the UN. Yeah.
Pretty crazy stuff. So let's just jump right in
Yeah.
to this 1, 2, 3 framework.
All right. So 1, 2, 3, you've got UB minus UM minus UD, which is Universal Brotherhood minus United Masters minus Universal Disarmament.
Right.
Now, the key point here is that they're not seen as three separate aims. They're actually all very much interconnected
Yeah.
and mutually reinforcing.
Right. You can't really have one without the other.
Exactly.
Oh,
That's quite a thing. You can't have disarmament without brotherhood.
Right.
That's really the core argument here.
And there's this feeling of urgency in these documents that I think is pretty palpable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's this real sense that something needs to change.
Yeah.
And it needs to change now. And the way they see it, the biggest threat that we're facing is the threat of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons.
Okay.
And so they're saying that this threat is so big.
Yeah. That it demands a fundamental shift in human consciousness
Right.
and a move toward greater unity and ultimately complete disarmament.
Yeah.
They even call this 1, 2, 3 framework
Okay.
a message, a signal, a directive of nature.
Okay.
So they're really suggesting that this isn't just some idea that they came up with.
Yeah.
They feel like this is something that the planet is telling us we need to do.
This is the way forward.
Exactly.
It's kind of written in the fabric of reality.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. So the first concrete thing
Right.
that they suggest in this document
Yeah.
is D1, this Declaration of Universal Emergency.
Yes. So essentially, D1 is a call for the world to formally recognize how dangerous these weapons of mass destruction are
Right.
and to declare a state of emergency in response.
Okay.
So the idea is that if we declare an emergency,
Yeah.
then that will focus our attention and our resources
Right.
on finding solutions.
It's like raising the global alarm.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like saying, hey, everybody.
We need to deal with this right now.
And given the state of the world, I think a
Yeah.
lot of people would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of anxiety out there
Yeah.
about where things are headed.
Right, for sure. Okay, so next, they talk about this visual idea,
Yeah.
this symbol that all the countries should adopt.
So D2 is this really interesting proposal. It's all about national flags.
Okay.
They're saying that all countries should add a common symbol to their flag.
Okay.
Some examples they give are the sunlight, the earth, but it could really be anything as long as everyone agrees on it.
Okay, and what's the point of that?
Well, the idea is that by having this shared symbol,
Yeah.
these really important symbols of national identity,
Right.
it will subtly but consistently reinforce this idea of global unity
Yeah.
and interconnectedness.
So it's about changing how we see ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about shifting our mindset from one of separation to one of unity.
Okay, interesting. So we've had this Declaration of Universal Emergency and then this kind of symbolic flag idea.
Yeah.
What's next?
So next up is D3, and this is where they really start to lay the groundwork
Okay.
for the entire initiative.
All right.
So D3 is a call for the world to formally recognize UBUMUD as a guiding principle for human civilization.
Okay.
So it's about saying, hey, this isn't just some random idea.
Yeah.
This is something that we should all be striving for.
So it's about getting buy-in from the whole world.
Exactly. It's about creating a shared vision
Yeah.
for the future.
Okay, so how do they think that's going to happen?
Well, that's where the really interesting part of this proposal comes in D4, the United Masters. Or,
Okay, so this is the big one.
yeah, this is the really unique part of this whole thing.
Okay.
They're proposing a new global body called the United Masters.
Okay.
And they envision it as a kind of upper house of the world.
So not to replace the UN, but to
Exactly. It's meant to work alongside the UN.
supplement.
Exactly.
Okay.
They described it as more pious, more effective, more influential than the UN.
Okay, so why do they think we need this new body?
Well, they argue that the problems we're facing today
Yeah.
are so complex that they require more than just political solutions.
Okay.
They believe that we need a body that's specifically focused on humanitarian and spiritual principles.
So it's about bringing ethics and morality
Exactly.
back into global politics.
Exactly. It's about saying that we need to look beyond just our own self-interest
Okay.
and start thinking about the good of humanity as a whole.
All right, so we've got this new global body
Right.
with kind of an ethical and spiritual focus.
Yeah.
Where do we go from there?
So in DeFi, they shift their focus to education.
Okay.
And they argue that we need to start teaching these principles to children from a young age.
All right, so this is about
Yeah.
embedding these ideas
Yeah.
into the next generation.
So rightly, they want to see UBU-MED incorporated into school curriculums all over the world.
So starting with the kids.
Right, because they're the ones who are going to inherit this world.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so then we move on to the media.
So D6 and D7 are all about getting the message out there.
Okay.
They're calling for the media to really engage with this 1, 2, 3 phenomenon.
All right, so what are they suggesting specifically?
Well, for electronic media, they're suggesting things like talk shows,
Okay.
global referendums, celebrity interviews, anything that will get people talking about these ideas.
So kind of like a big publicity campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. They want to create a buzz around UBU-MUD,
Okay.
and then D7 is focused on filmmakers.
All right, so what do they want filmmakers to do?
They're calling on filmmakers to create short films and documentaries
Okay.
that explore these ideas.
So using storytelling to kind of spread the message.
Exactly. Yeah. They believe that film is a powerful tool for changing hearts and minds.
Okay, so we've gone from education to media,
Right.
and now this is where it gets really weird.
Yeah, D8 is where things take a bit of a turn.
Yeah, this one threw me for a loop, I'll be honest.
Yeah, it's definitely unexpected. So they're proposing that we recognize 9/11 as Universal Brotherhood Day.
Okay.
Now, obviously, when
Okay.
people hear 9/11, they think of the tragedy.
Yeah, of course.
But what they're doing here is they're trying to reframe that date
Okay.
and connect it to other historical events
Okay.
that are more in line with their message.
All right, so what are those events?
So they point out that September 11th, 1893 was the day that Swami Vivekananda gave his famous speech
Okay.
at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago,
Okay.
where he talked about the idea of a universal religion.
Okay.
And then they also point out that September 11th, 1906
Okay.
was the day that Mahatma Gandhi started his Satyagraha movement in South Africa,
Okay.
which was all about nonviolent resistance.
So they're trying to kind of reclaim 9/11.
Exactly. Yeah, they're trying to turn it into a day that's about unity and peace.
Interesting. Okay, so we've kind of gone through this whole progression of ideas.
Right.
And then D9 brings us to the G20.
Yeah. So in D9, they're calling for the G20 nations to discuss the issue of a WMD-free Earth
Okay.
at their upcoming summits.
So taking it to the world leaders.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
saying that this is something that needs to be discussed at the highest level.
And they specifically mention some upcoming summits.
Yeah, they specifically mention Italy in 2021, Indonesia in 2022,
Right.
and India in 2023.
All right, so they're saying these are the key summits to focus on.
Right. They're saying that these summits are crucial
Okay.
because of what they call the complex nuclear warming terror and COVID scenario.
Okay, so they're saying that
Yeah,
the world is in such a precarious state right now
exactly.
that these conversations are absolutely essential.
Exactly. They're saying that we're at a tipping point.
Okay, and now we come to the second document, this
Yeah.
proposal to the UN.
So this document is a formal proposal that was sent to the UN on March 30th, 2025.
Okay.
And it's addressed to some pretty important people.
Okay, who are we talking about?
Well, it's addressed to the Secretary General of the UN, the President of the General Assembly,
Yeah.
and the President of the International Court of Justice.
Wow, so the top people at the UN.
Exactly, yeah. They're really trying to get this in front of the people who can make a difference.
And what exactly are they asking for in this proposal?
Well, they're asking for the UN to formally recognize the UBUMUD initiative.
Okay, so they want the UN to get on board.
Exactly, yeah. They want the UN to endorse this framework.
Interesting. And the document also names the person behind this whole initiative.
Yeah, it says that the initiative is the work of Kumar Trasham, the Divine Force 123.
Okay, so there's definitely a spiritual element here.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
The document explicitly states that this whole initiative is guided by the grace of goddess Durga and god
Okay.
generator, operator, destroyer.
All right, so this is not just a political or social movement.
Right, it's very much rooted in spirituality.
Yeah. Okay, so what else do we need to know about this proposal?
Well, they reiterate the point that real progress on issues of peace and disarmament has been elusive. And they argue that the world is facing an increasing threat of conflict.
Yeah.
They even mention the possibility of a third world war.
Okay.
Or a nuclear catastrophe.
So they're saying that the stakes are incredibly high.
Extremely high.
Okay.
And they keep coming back to this idea that the missing piece
Right.
is the United Masters.
Okay, so remind us again what the United Masters is all about.
So the United Masters is envisioned as a spiritual and humanitarian structure
Okay.
that will complement the UN.
Right.
And they believe that it's the key to achieving both universal brotherhood and universal disarmament.
Okay.
They even use the analogy of Shiva and Shakti
Okay.
to represent this idea of synergy between the two.
Interesting. And they actually go into quite a bit of detail
Yeah,
about how the United Masters would be structured.
Yeah, they've really thought this
Okay,
out.
so what does it look like?
So they've proposed 9 different organs
9. Okay.
of the United Masters.
All right, lay it on me.
All right, so first you've got the Prayer Council,
Oh.
which would be responsible for fostering global prayer.
Okay, so kind of a global spiritual center.
Exactly.
Okay, what's next?
Then you've got the Spiritual Assembly,
Okay.
which would be a gathering of enlightened leaders from all over the world.
So kind of a council of wise elders?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you've got the Secretariat,
Okay.
which would handle all the administrative stuff.
Right. So the nuts and bolts of the organization.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we've got the spiritual side
Right.
and the administrative side. What else?
Then you've got the Universal Court of Justice,
Okay.
which would complement the existing International Court of Justice,
Okay.
but with an added focus on ethics and spirituality.
Interesting. So it's like a higher court
Right.
that takes into account more than just the law.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Okay, what's next?
Then there's the Universal Monetary Fund,
Okay.
which would focus on equitable resource distribution.
So kind of a global redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, something like that.
Yep.
And then there's the Earth Planetary Commission, which would be all about environmental stewardship.
Okay, so taking care of the planet.
Exactly.
All right.
Then there's the World Advisory Forum,
Okay.
which would provide guidance on humanitarian issues.
Okay, so kind of like a global think tank.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
And then you've got the Universal Border Resolution Force,
Okay.
which would work to peacefully resolve territorial disputes.
Okay, so kind of a global peacekeeping force.
Exactly.
All right. And what's the last one?
And finally, there's the Global Warming Commission,
Okay.
which would focus on tackling climate change.
Okay, so a pretty comprehensive
Yeah.
set of institutions here.
Very comprehensive.
All right, so they've really laid out this vision
Yeah.
for how the United Masters would work.
Right. And they're really calling on world leaders
Yeah.
to take this seriously.
Okay.
They're urging them to recognize UBUMUD as a universal mandate
Okay.
for the good of all humanity.
So they're really trying to make this an imperative for global action.
Exactly.
And they talk about the spiritualization of politics.
Yeah, they're saying that we need to bring ethics and morality
Right.
back into the political sphere.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have,
Right.
laws and treaties and institutions.
Yeah, we need something more than that.
Yeah, we need a change of heart.
Exactly.
Okay, so they've got this whole vision for the United Masters.
Right.
But they also talk about the limitations of our current systems.
Yeah, they're pretty critical
Okay.
of the way things are.
All right, so what are they saying?
Well, they argue that national governments are simply not equipped
Yeah.
to handle the challenges that we're facing today.
Okay.
And they're also critical of the UN.
Okay, in what way?
Well, they say that while the UN has been successful in preventing another world war,
Yeah.
it's still limited by the influence of superpowers.
Right, so they're saying that the UN
Yeah,
is kind of stuck in this old way of doing things.
exactly.
And it's not really able to adapt to the new challenges. Okay, so they're offering the United Masters as an alternative.
Right.
Or at least as a supplement.
As a way to move beyond
Yeah.
the limitations of the current system.
And they even draw parallels to the League of Nations.
Right.
And the formation of the UN.
Yeah, they point out that both of those organizations were created in response to global crises.
Okay.
And they argue that we're in a similar situation today.
Okay.
They say that the looming threat of a third world war
Yeah.
requires us to create a new, higher unified authority.
And that authority would be the United Masters.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's their big pitch to
Yeah.
the world.
Right.
So what happens next?
Well, the document ends by talking about their outreach efforts.
Oh.
They say that they're reaching out to 1,008 global personalities
Okay.
from all walks of life.
All right, so scientists, artists, politicians,
Exactly.
spiritual leaders.
Yeah. Anyone who they think can help to build consensus
Okay.
around this idea.
And what's the ultimate goal of all of this?
The ultimate goal is to create a world of universal brotherhood, peace, and harmony.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a pretty ambitious vision.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to take in.
It is.
So we've gone through these documents. We've looked at this 1, 2, 3 framework,
Right.
this proposal for United Masters,
Yeah.
and this whole vision for a global transformation.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And, hopefully this is giving you a better understanding of how they think we can achieve world peace.
Hopefully it's giving you some things to think about.
Yeah, and we've seen some really interesting things.
Yeah.
Like the reframing of 9/11
Yeah, that was pretty wild.
and the incredibly detailed structure
Wait.
that they've come up with for the United Masters.
It's really impressive how much thought they've put into this.
It is. So here's a final question for you to consider.
Okay.
We've talked about the League of Nations. We've talked about the UN.
Right, yeah.
These big global organizations that
Yeah.
have tried to create peace.
Yeah.
What do you think are the biggest obstacles to creating this United Masters?
That's a good question.
What are the things that are going to get in the way?
Well,
And on the flip side, what do you think is the greatest potential
yeah.
for this idea?
Well, I think the greatest potential is that it offers a new way of thinking
Okay.
about global governance.
Okay.
It's not just about politics and power.
Right.
It's about ethics and spirituality.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity
Okay.
and working together for the good of all.
But getting people to actually do that,
Right.
that's the hard part.
It's a challenge.
And how do you think the spiritualization of politics
Yeah.
would actually play out on a global scale?
Well, that's a big question.
It is.
And I don't think there's an easy answer,
Yeah.
but I think it's a conversation that we need to have
Yeah, absolutely.
if we want to create a better future.
Okay. So something to think about.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
All right.
Bye.